Hi, boys and girls. Welcome to another Grandma Sheila Stories. Our story today is called Joe Green's Lunch. Well, it all started in the schoolyard of the academy. All the boys liked to take their lunch pails or their lunch baskets. In those days, they didn't have lunch boxes like we have. They had bales, little buckets with handles on top, or they had baskets, and that's what they brought their lunches in. Well, they would bring their basket or their pail outside and they would sit under the trees on the grass and they would eat their lunch and visit. And then they would leave it all there and run as fast as they could out to play whatever they were going to play, football or whatever that day. Well, this day they were sitting there eating, all of them together, when all of a sudden Howard said, "Guys, you know, that Joe Green in our class, he never comes out here and sits under the trees and eats his lunch with us. And I don't know where he even goes for lunch." And then one of the other kids popped up and said, "Well, maybe he has so many treats in his lunchbox he's afraid we'll rob him." And then Will said, "I don't think that's the case. Maybe he doesn't even have anything in his lunchbox. Maybe it's just empty. You know, I heard my father say that it's been really tight for the Green family since Mr. Green was killed. And my mom said she doesn't pity them at all because nobody should be poor and be proud." Well, then Sammy said, "You know, Mrs. Green came to our house one day and asked my mom if she had any sewing that she could do for us. And people do that. They get jobs without being poor." Well, then Will had to get back in the act again. And he said, "Hey, guys, I've got an idea. Tomorrow morning, we will come early because Joe, you guys all know that Joe comes before the bell rings in the morning, before the first bell, not the second bell when we're always just getting there. And he's always at his desk working on his homework. If we come early, that'll give us time to go into the coat room and we can look in his lunch pail and see what he brings." Well, the only one that hadn't been saying anything was Ned Collins, and he'd just been sitting there dutifully eating his lunch. And pretty soon he stood up and he brushed all the crumbs off of himself, and he said, "Guys, I don't think that's very nice. It sounds mean and it sounds sneaky. What what difference is it to you what he brings in his lunch pail to eat or where he eats his lunch?" But they'd already made their decision. So the next morning, before the first bell rang, they got there, and all the boys, they peeked in the crack into the classroom, and sure enough, the only one there was Joe Green sitting at his desk, filling out his algebra assignment. And Will said, "Come on, guys, shh." Then they heard the first bell, and they rushed into the coat room before anybody else could come. And they went right over to where they saw Joe's lunch pail. And that lunch pail was really a lunch pail. It was big. And one of the boys said, "Wow, that lunch pail's so big, it could feed a whole regiment of the army and for one meal." Well, Will said, "Shh, we don't want anybody to know we're here." said, I'm going to look in there. So he picked up the pail and he pulled off the towel off the top and he set it aside. And then he was confused. There was a newspaper. Who puts a newspaper in their lunch? And then he thought, well, maybe he reads the newspaper during lunch instead of coming out. So he stuck it over to the side, and then he looked in the pail. There was only one other thing in that pail. A plain old potato. A baked potato with nothing on it. And Will, he covered his face and he started to laugh. A potato for lunch. Isn't that funny, guys? A potato, a plain old potato. Well, all the boys laughed hysterically. It was so funny. They thought it was so funny. Well, then Howard said, I have an idea. Let's throw away everything in his lunch pail and let's fill it up with coal out of the coal box in the corner. Well, they all agreed that that was a good idea. And they all started quietly carrying chunks of coal and filling up that bucket. Well, then they thought, if he just saw it in there, that wouldn't be any fun. So they took the newspaper and they put it back inside of the bucket. And they put the towel on top of it so it looked like it had before. And then they put it down. They put it back right where Joe had left it. And they said, come on, let's get out of here. Well, they all laughed. That is, except for Ned. Now, the boys had kind of wondered, why had Ned even come this morning? He'd said this was sneaky and mean. Why would he even come? But he was there. Well, everybody left, and they didn't notice that Ned didn't leave. And Ned, he thought for just a few minutes, and then he reached over on the other shelf, and he got his lunch basket. His Aunt Sally made him the most delectable lunches. And he had a wonderful idea. He opened up his lunch basket. And then he took the top off of Joe's lunch basket. And he moved the newspaper over to one side. And he started putting the stuff out of his lunch basket into that bucket after he had dumped all the coal. Of course, he wouldn't put the food on top of the coal. Then, when he had all his food in the bottom of it, he put the newspaper so it was over top of the food. And then he put the towel over top of everything. And then he put his nice towel over the top of his basket so it looked just like it had before. And he put it on the shelf. And then he quickly, as fast as he could, went out the other door of the classroom, and he came in the main door and sat down like nothing was happening. But when he got sat down again, he felt guilty as could be, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. And all morning, and my, was it a long morning, all morning the other boys Every once in a while, they would giggle, they would look at each other, they would poke at each other, and they would wink like, ooh, we have some great secret. Finally, that bell rang for lunch, and all the kids got up and ran to the coat room and grabbed their buckets, including Joe and including Nick. I said Nick, and I meant to say Ned. They all took their baskets and they went running out with them. But all those boys, instead of going out under the trees like they always did, they circled back around and went down the hall and went around the corner, and they waited. Well, it wasn't too long till they saw Ned Collins walking down the hall, but he was walking the wrong way. He wasn't going toward the playground. And one of them stuck his head out and said, "Hey, Ned, what are you doing? Where are you going?" And Ned said, "I'm going home." They said, "Why are you going home?" And he said, "Well, this morning Aunt Sally was making some of the most delectable looking treats I've ever seen, and I want to go home and make sure I get my share." So Ned went on home. Nobody knew that Ned's lunchbox was totally empty. That basket with the red and white check top on it, there was not one thing left in it. Well, Ned went on his way. But then the boys were starting to talk just a little bit, and then they went, shh, and they saw Joe Green coming down the hall carrying that big basket. And Sammy said, "I wonder if he knows anything, 'cause surely the coal is heavier than that potato would have been." But he didn't seem to act like he knew anything was wrong. When he went inside the classroom, the boys tiptoed down and they peeked through the crack again. And there was Joe with that huge lunch pail. And he wasn't paying much attention. He pulled off the towel, he put it over there. It was like he didn't even look in it. Well, then he started to pull the newspaper out, but it was stuck. He couldn't get it out. And he looked down and he got the strangest look on his face. He pulled out his newspaper and he set it on his desk and he stuck his hand into his bucket. There was a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. He set that to one side. He reached in again and there was a delectable looking sandwich. Then he pulled out a little jar full of milk. Where had all this food come from? He pulled out a shiny red apple. Oh, it looked so good. Then he pulled out some raisins and nuts in a bag. He hadn't had raisins or nuts in who knows how long. He couldn't remember when. But in the bottom, he found the most beautiful little pie. And look at the juice on the top of it. It had to be a blueberry pie. He couldn't imagine, where did all this food come from? He stuck his bucket down on the floor and he just sat there and looked at all. A pie, even. And then he put his arms down on the top of his desk and he put his head down. And one of the other little boys out in the hall that was peeking through the crack in the door said, "He must be praying." And all the boys were suddenly ashamed. And they headed out into the playground with their lunches. But now they didn't feel too much like eating. When they got there, they sat down. And Sammy said, I felt guilty all morning and my stomach didn't feel good. This wasn't nice, it was mean. And then he said, my dad told me that Mr. Green wouldn't have had to have died, but he made sure everybody else was safe first. He was a brave man. Well, now Will was feeling bad and he put his head down. He was ashamed. Well, that afternoon, when everybody else was getting ready to go home, Sammy ran over to talk to Ned. And he told Ned everything that had happened after they got out of the coat room. And all that they had seen and the food that had come out of the pail. And how Will had said, "This looks like something nice that Ned Collins would have done." And he told him that all the other boys, they had taken off their hats and they had thrown them up in the air. And they had stood up and they'd went, "Hooray for Ned Collins! Hooray! Hooray!" Well, Ned didn't say anything about the food that he had put in Joe's lunch pail, but he did say one thing. It's poor fun that must be earned by making fun of someone else and hurting their feelings. I hope, boys and girls, that you remember that poking fun at other people is not fun. Little boys and girls that are born with legs that aren't straight, or some poor child that's been in a fire and they're deformed from it, or someone that's not as smart as you. Don't make fun of them. That's something that Jesus would have never done, and he doesn't want you to either. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next weekend. Bye-bye.